It's Friday, the 28th of February 2025. Here are some of the headlines making wave on the Nigeria's dailies today. First, let's begin with the Punch newspaper. The leading story: I am loyal to Tinubu, but my actions are mine, says Obasa. This can be found on page 2 and 7 of the paper. Above the leading story, we have consumers kick as FG plans fresh power tariff hike. This can be found on page 27 of the paper. NLC shelves protest as subscribers welcome 35% tariff hike. I rejected 500 million naira gifts during my mother's burial, says EFCC chair. This can be found on page 42 of the paper. Natasha threatens to expose Akpabio as group petitions Senate. This can be found on page 39 of the paper. Below the leading story, we have Ramadan. Sultan alerts Muslims on Moon. Bauchi Kebbi schools short. This can be found on page 43 of the paper. Driver handed Oyo copper to kidnappers, says sister. This can be found on page 4 and 6 of the Punch newspaper. Nigerian passengers stranded in Togo after Air France flight diversion. This can be found on page 27 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian. The leading story: War against fake drugs. How systematic insufficient complicity aid multi-trillion naira illicit trade. This can be found on page 4 and 6 of the paper. Above the leading story, we have Obasanjo, 7 ex-leaders, 6 debt relief for African countries. This can be found on page 7 of the paper. Air Force investigates as officer kills 1, injures 2 in Kaduna. This can be found on page 8 of the paper. Below the bolder text, we have at Reps hearing, FG rules out inheritance tax in reform bills. This can be found on page 3 of the paper. NANS Action Aid demand release of kidnapped Benue Varsity students. This can be found on page 30 of the paper. Mass wedding. Kebbi pays 54 million naira as bride price for 300 couples. This can be found on page 28 of the paper. Statutory revenue raises from 622.1 billion naira as FG states LGAs shares 1.70 trillion naira. This can be found on page 3 of the paper. FG to review electricity tariff for band B, C customers as subsidy hits 4 trillion naira. This can be found on page 6 of the paper. Chaos, confusion, thrills claims to Lagos Assembly speakership. This can be found on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. The leading story: Lagos Assembly crisis. Obasa Miranda claims speakership. Below the leading story, we have after 21 months, Buhari relocates from Daura to Kaduna. ACF, Nasima, CAC re-echoes concerns over tax reform bills. Band B customers not paying enough for electricity, says Minister of Power. Sultan urges traders to reduce food prices ahead Ramadan. This can be found on page 3 of the Daily Trust. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard. The leading story: Lagos Assembly crisis. Obasa storms house with armed men, precise over 4-man faction. Above the leading story, we have Pencom slams 14 billion naira fine on 911 employers for late pension remittance. We are not ashamed to copy what works, importer claims, says Tinubu. This can be found on page 8 of the paper. Sultan urges Muslims to look for Ramadan crescent from today. Diplomat seeks visa ban for erring public servants in Rivers, Osun, Benue. This can be found on page 9 of the paper. Below the leading story, we have State of the Nation. Leaders, followers responsible for Nigeria's woes, says Fubara, Daniel, Adams, others. This can be found on page 10 of the paper. Electricity. Business owners, CSOs, kicks as FG plans another tariff hike. This can be found on page 5 of the paper. ECOWAS, exit of Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, disrupting security framework, says Air Chief. This can be found on page 9 of the paper. Adopters of Makurdi Varsity female students demand 40 million naira ransom. This can be found on page 7 of the Vanguard newspaper. Super Eagles cannot do well without Lukman, Simeon, says Real. This can be found on page 48 of the paper. Moving over to the next paper, Business Day. The leading story, High BB's tango with IMF. Truths, half-truths, lies. Nollywood's child content push open opportunity. This can be found on page 30 of the Business Day paper. Obasa presides over Lagos Assembly amid lawmakers' rejection. This can be found on page 7 of the Business Day paper. And if any of these stories caught your attention, do well to get a copy of the newspaper to read the complete story. And these are the headlines making wave on Nigeria's dailies today.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.